Good morning and welcome to Advancing Transportation Equity. I'm Andy Moore. I retired a little over a year ago from PBS Wisconsin, where I served as senior political news producer for over 30 years. In my retirement, I've joined the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired as a copywriter. And even though I've only been in that position for about 6 months, I've learned so much. Uh, and we hope you'll learn during this hour as our panel helps you understand why transportation equity is important to all Wisconsinites. And we hope you'll know a little bit better about the reasons why it matters by the time we're finished over the next hour. In a moment, I'll introduce you to our panelists, but first let me tell you that our forum today is presented in conjunction with Community Shares of Wisconsin, an organization that brings nonprofits together to raise awareness of their important work. Our forum is part of a Big Share event going on all day today. It's the 9th annual Community Shares online day of giving focused on social and environmental justice. Nearly 70 nonprofits host this important day of local fundraising. Two of those member organizations are represented here today. The bigshare.org is where to go to give to our organizations represented here in our forum, or to provide a gift more largely to Community Shares itself, which brings us, as promised, to the introduction of our participants. Welcome to Denise Jess. Denise is the Executive Director of the Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired, a Community Shares of Wisconsin member organization. Denise is also the Wisconsin Non-Driver Advisory Committee Co-Chair and City of Madison Transportation Commissioner. Denise, will you tell the audience a little more about the Council's work and mission, please?
Yeah, you bet. Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Andy. The Wisconsin Council of the Blind and Visually Impaired has a statewide mission to promote the dignity and empowerment of people living with vision loss through advocacy, education, and vision services. We know that there are approximately 110,000 Wisconsinites who live with vision loss. We estimate that that's an underrepresented number, but that's the number we're working with. And we know that the greatest majority of folks with significant vision loss are older adults, age 55 and beyond, who are experiencing diseases like macular degeneration, glaucoma, and retinopathy due to diabetes. We also know that these numbers are not proportionate. So while 4.2% of our older adults are people living with vision loss, we see greater numbers across the board of folks from our BIPOC communities and women and people living in poverty and low income. So yeah, really excited to be able to talk about transportation equity today, which significantly impacts our population. Thanks so much, Andy.
Thank you, Denise. But Barbara Beckert is also on the panel today, and she's the Director of External Advocacy with Disability Rights Wisconsin. Barbara is a non-driver advisory committee member. Disability Rights of Wisconsin is also a member of Community Shares. Greetings, Barbara, and will you speak briefly about Disability Rights Wisconsin's work?
Thank you, Andy. It's great to be here together with our partners for this important conversation. Disability Rights Wisconsin is a protection and advocacy agency for Wisconsinites with disabilities in our state, and we're part of a national network of protection and advocacy agencies. Every day, our attorneys and advocates are working to ensure the rights of Wisconsinites with disabilities. We provide individual advocacy and also work on system change and public policy. DRW supports the rights of people with disabilities to live as independently as possible and be contributing members of our community, and access to accessible, affordable transportation is critical to those rights. Some of DRW's priorities include abuse and neglect, receiving services in the least restrictive environment, access to special education services, accessing community-based long-term care and mental health services, discrimination in employment and housing, and voting rights. Transportation plays a role in so many of those areas of people's lives, and we're looking forward to the conversation today.
Thank you, Barbara. Nonprofits, if they're doing their job well, as these organizations are, work closely with the state of Wisconsin. And the state plays an important positive role when it comes to making positive changes in transportation equity. That's why we're fortunate to have Tammy Jackson with us today. Tammy is the public policy analyst and legislative liaison for the Wisconsin Board for People with Developmental Disabilities. Tammy is also the Wisconsin Non-Driver Advisory Co-Chair. Tammy, welcome, and please tell our audience about the Wisconsin Board for People with Developmental Disabilities.
Well, we are an independent state agency. That means that we are independent from the executive and the legislative branch because one of our roles is to advise them both on public policy. We're created under a federal law that is intended to improve the self-determination. That is, do you get to make your choices about your own life? Independence, productivity, integration, and inclusion of people with intellectual and developmental disabilities and their families. And we do that through systems change, which is a fancy word of saying we think about how things are now and figure out how we can make them better. And we do that a lot of times through public policy. And certainly transportation is one of those core pillars that you need to be independent, productive, integrated, and included. So we're very happy to be here today to talk about this issue that impacts not only so many people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, but their families.
Thank you, Tammy Jackson. Thank you very much for those preliminary remarks. A quick fact to keep in mind as we begin, the Wisconsin Department of Transportation reports that 31% of Wisconsinites are non-drivers. Non-drivers and the inequities of transportation impact not only the non-drivers' lives, but all of our lives due to the consequences inequities deliver economically and in other ways across the board. It is indeed a complex topic. And Denise, Jess, who are non-drivers? There are a variety of circumstances that lead to a person being a non-driver. Will you talk about those?
Yeah, happy to. When we think of the non-driver, I think many of us may picture someone like me, a person with a disability. They may picture an older adult. And yes, that is certainly, we are significant numbers of that 31%. And we're much more diverse than that. So when I think about non-drivers, I think about us in a couple of different categories. One are those of us who are non-drivers by circumstance. So how we show up in this world or the things that have happened with us lead us to being non-drivers. So again, people with a variety of disabilities, older adults who are no longer driving, folks who have limited income or maybe living in poverty and maybe can't afford a car, car deficient households where maybe there is a car, but there are more places to go than a single car can really manage. And so that car is stretched significantly. Other folks may include students and young adults. The Wisconsin Department of Transportation tells us that people are delaying getting their driver's license, and part of that is because our schools no longer provide driver's education, and for a student to attend a driver's ed program is several $100s, so it becomes an economic barrier. So in addition to people who are non-drivers because of circumstance, maybe they also can't obtain a driver's license for a variety of reasons. We also have people who are non-drivers by choice. And so for whatever reason, whether it's environmental or quality of life, choose to get to where they need to go in other ways besides driving a car. I think one of the common perceptions is that non-drivers live primarily in urban areas, and this is inaccurate. It's a great time to challenge that assumption. We have non-drivers living from north to south and from rural to urban. 97% of our state's land mass is rural, and 30% of our population lives in communities under 10,000. So this is an issue that stretches across our state and impacts people from a variety of life experiences. Tammy noted, and I want to pick up on that, that it also impacts families. And so for the non-driver, the people in that person's universe often are needing to step in and support the non-driver in getting to where they need to go at costs to their to themselves, you know, maybe employment costs or quality of life costs or family stressors costs. So the circle keeps expanding when we really take an inclusive look at who are our non-drivers.
Tammy, Denise did a good job of describing the personal diversity backgrounds of non-drivers, as well as geographic. Could you please talk about, with that in mind, limitations in transportation options, including in the area of pedestrian and bicycling?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think if your listeners take a moment, because many of our listeners are drivers, and you thought about if all of a sudden you weren't driving a car, what would you do? And some of us would be able to cobble together a plan for like a few days or a week. But when you start thinking about that as a permanent thing that you can't do, most of us have very few options, no matter where you live. There are many places in the state that do not have mass transit, for example, like a bus system or a cab system. Even if you do have mass transit in your area, does it go where you want to go at the times you need it to? Is it affordable? All of the answers to those questions may be no, in which case your non-driver status really boxes in what you're able to do. In rural areas, there may be programs available, but they're small. They don't have an unlimited number of rides, and they may be restricted to only certain populations. We have not had such an inclusive view of who non-drivers are. And so some of the policies that we have made in the past have created programs that are, say, only for people of a certain age, or only for people who have veteran status, or only for people with disabilities, or only for people who are eligible for Medicaid for medical rides only. So the patchwork of things that are available aren't necessarily able to be used by any non-driver, and they certainly are not enough to guarantee that you can get where you need to go on your schedule. In terms of pedestrians, the same thing is a challenge. For those of us who live in urban settings, whether or not you have sidewalks, whether or not there are curb cuts, how far is the distance to a safe crossing with, say, a traffic light? These are all huge considerations. How far do you have to walk to get to your public transportation, if there is any? And for a lot of people who have mobility problems, or just need to build in time for that extra walking piece, it's a significant barrier to being able to get lots of places.
You just described a mountain of challenges in those remarks. People who encounter public services, you use the word patchwork, can get lost in the patchwork of programs that may give them a solution or some options that can be complicated for anyone. Can you talk a little bit about that challenge and how to handle it?
Yeah, I think when you talk with non-drivers, they will tell you about the mental load that it takes to be constantly planning A, plan B, plan C, of how to get from here to there. And, to give you some context, some of these programs that we're talking about, it isn't just call on demand. You may have to reserve a spot more than a week in advance, and then your appointment changes and you can't get a ride to the new time. There are a lot of non-drivers who spend a good proportion of their mental energy just planning, how do I do this if it can happen at all? And then also a ton of time in transit. It's very difficult to navigate. And in some places, your options are even more limited. So there may not be anything to choose from. Denise's comment about family caregivers stepping in is really important. We did a survey as a large disability coalition in 2018 that found that about 70% of the time, people were relying on family caregivers to get them where they needed to go. And there's also a limit to how many times you can kind of tap into that source. But, you know, when we think about how much family caregivers are doing, a lot of them are leaving the workforce entirely or reducing hours to part-time. And part of why they're having to do that is because they're having to get people places like medical appointments, et cetera, that there is no service for those people to get to reliably.
Tammy, it's clumsy of me to say equity in transportation is a moving target, but equity in transportation can be made more challenging as one moves, literally from one municipality or county to another. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. And you don't need to go far to figure out where the boundary of a town or a county is, because transportation ends at the boundary line. So for a lot of our programs, they serve a certain geographical area, often defined by where the city or the county boundary is. And a great example that used to be true is, you know, Monona has a bus system and so does Madison, but the two never do connect. So you don't have to be you can be in the middle of an urban area with public transit and not be able to connect necessarily. As we have developed, you know, medical facilities and work, kind of industrial workforce centers, I don't think we've been thinking about it from a non-driver perspective, because many of those places are serving a more regional group of people, and there isn't regional transportation for non-drivers. So it's really challenging for folks to figure out how do you get to the next county line over, to the regional medical center if you're 20 miles away. It doesn't have to be a great distance to be an absolutely impenetrable barrier. And frankly, a lot of times people aren't getting there, right? The limiting factor in their lives is transportation. And if they can't figure out a transportation that's affordable and reliable and gets them where they need to go on their schedule, it means they don't do it.
Tammy, we're going to circle back to you in a little bit. I'm going to move on to pick Barbara Beckert's brain. But before I do, very briefly, services for those in need of transportation. What is there to know about that?
Well, a lot of people will contact the Aging and Disability Resource Centers. Certainly, a lot of people will look to their local resource centers, but there isn't any one-stop shop or one fix. And frankly, we spend a lot of time talking to other policymakers and saying, you know, who want a simple solution. There isn't. That patchwork that we're talking about is really a problem. You can have an app, but if there aren't any transportation options, that's what it's going to tell you.
Tammy Jackson, thank you. As I said, I want to return to you in just a little bit. Let's get some thoughts from Barbara Beckert, the Director of External Advocacy with Disability Rights Wisconsin. Barbara, it's hard enough for a driver to get access to healthcare, education, employment, but for the non-driver, those challenges escalate. Explain how that is.
Yeah, as we've heard from Tammy, Andy, people with disabilities and other non-drivers often face barriers to accessing transportation, and that hinders their ability to find or keep a job, to get to medical appointments, to visit friends and family, to vote, and to participate in their community. So if you're a non-driver, your ability to get to places on time may be out of your control. In spite of the planning that you do, you may be late for work, for a medical appointment, for school, or for an important event such as a funeral, or you may not be able to get there at all. We find that people who are non-drivers often rely on transportation programs to get to medical services. And some of these medical services are critically important. Dialysis, chemotherapy are a couple of examples. These are frequent appointments and they are important literally to people's survival. If you can't count on your transportation provider to get you there on time and pick you up afterwards when you're in a weakened condition, your health and even your life may be at risk.
And as you very briefly touched on, your citizenship, if you can't get to the polls to try to enact change with your ballot, it's no surprise then, given those kinds of setbacks, that there are also emotional, mental health consequences for a person experiencing transportation inequities, are there not?
Yes, absolutely. Many individuals rely on transportation services, for example, to be able to keep a job. In a survey that Tammy referred to about transportation services, 59% of the respondents, people with disabilities, indicated that current transportation services limit my ability to find or keep a job. That isolates people. And times it may result in them losing a job if they're unable to have reliable transportation. That takes a toll on your mental health, as well as your financial health and your ability to be independent. So the consequences are quite significant.
What about the lack of accessible transportation for people using mobility devices? What are the implications there?
Well, one implication I would say, again, thinking about the workforce shortage, is it means that people do not have access to the transportation that they need to find and keep employment. Individuals who have mobility needs often require accessible transportation, and that's particularly in short supply, especially in rural areas of our state. So as a result, I think it has a direct economic impact if people can't get the transportation, the accessible transportation that they need to get to work. Our community is losing out. And if you look more broadly, we are seeing a shortage of direct care workers right now. And those are low-income workers. Lack of access to transportation has an impact on their ability to be able to find and keep employment as well. For many people with disabilities, they are facing a dire shortage of direct care workers right now. Providing access to affordable transportation is part of the solution and should be prioritized by our policymakers.
Barbara, I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm sorry in advance for doing this, but I want to ask you if you can populate your points with an example of someone, a case of someone that you've been made aware of in your work that has had to struggle with these challenges, either involving getting to see their primary doctor or getting to the polls. Again, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but can you think of a story that could put a face, not necessarily a name, on this challenge?
Yeah, absolutely. At Disability Rights Wisconsin, we staff a voter hotline, and voters are able to call us all year round to ask for assistance. And one of the calls that we get most often is people who need transportation. So just recently, during the February primary, I got a call from someone with a mobility related disability. She very much wanted to vote and to get to her polling place. And her polling place was not that far away, but there were icy conditions. And she tried to walk over there using her mobility device to get to the polling place that was too icy, and she felt that it was dangerous. And she contacted us hoping that we could provide her with some kind of access to transportation. And she lived in the Stevens Point area. And I was so disappointed that I wasn't able to come up with an option for her. And it was even more disappointing for her because as a result, she was not able to cast a ballot in a very important election.
Thank you, Barbara. I want to shift gears and return to you, Denise, Jess, to learn a little more about the on the ground aspects of this. Denise, how many non-drivers need to walk and or bike to complete a trip? Talk about the meaning of that.
Yeah, thanks, Andy. I think the pedestrian and bicyclist are really important to include in this conversation, because the reality is not only are non-drivers pedestrians, drivers are too. You know, there are simply ways that even a driver needs to walk in order to complete a trip. So the issue of infrastructure that supports pedestrians and bicyclists is really critical, and it's often a piece that's left out of these kinds of conversations about the needs of of non-drivers. So concretely, if you are using mass transit to get to someplace, that bus doesn't get you door-to-door service. You need to go to a stop to get it, and you need to exit the bus at a stop and then still likely walk to the destination. And so you might have a lot of ease in getting there on the bus, but you get off the bus and there's only the cement pad at the bus stop. There's no sidewalk. Now, whether you're using a mobility device or not, you have to decide, am I walking in the roadway to get to where I need to go? Am I walking on the shoulder? Am I walking in the grass if it's, weather that's conducive to that? And you can see, in places where there's this broken transportation, what transportation engineers call cow paths. So people have walked in the grass so much to get from the bus stop to the destination that they've worn off the grass. And so that whole broken network is significant. Other places where the network might be broken is you've got the sidewalk, but now you need to cross multiple lanes of traffic in order to get to the destination. And you're walking out of your way to try to find a signalized intersection, or maybe there's a signalized intersection, but it doesn't have an accessible pedestrian signal or a walk light. And one of the most dangerous things that pedestrians do is cross streets, plain and simple. A car that hits a pedestrian, if the car is traveling 40 miles an hour, the risk of death or serious injury to the pedestrian is significant. That won't end well for the person not inside the steel box. So that disconnected network is really significant. It's true in our rural areas too. I think sometimes, again, folks don't think about people in rural areas needing to be pedestrians or bicyclists, and they are. So if they need to get to the grocery, and as Barbara and Tammy described, it's so terribly impossible to get a ride to the grocery because it's not a particular non-driver program, they're likely to just try to walk to get there. And maybe they can get to a full grocery, but maybe they're going to a convenience store. And so the whole issue of not getting good food also comes into this. But they're trying to walk along a roadway where maybe there's no sidewalks and on the shoulder. And cars may be going, really excessive speeds, or at least quickly, because maybe it's a major thoroughfare where the speed limit is not reduced. During the pandemic, we have seen a significant increase across the country of pedestrian versus vehicle incidences. And again, the outcome for the pedestrian has not been good.
Denise, I believe this will come up in an organic way later, but in doing my research to participate today, there's a theme that I think is worthy of our attention even at this moment. You make reference to the disconnected network. This is part and parcel and has its roots in what I have heard you describe as a car-centric way of thinking about transportation as opposed to a person or human-centric. Make the relationship there for us, if you would please, as far as having that be somewhat of a barrier for a positive change.
Yeah, I really appreciate that question. So, if you think about how our world is built, it puts the car at the center of the universe. We think about our roads and what's going to move the car with the greatest ease, and and a lot of times at higher speeds. And so we have not, and we've been doing that for decades. And so we have not been thinking about the concept of all users, all ages, all abilities, all modes until much more recently. Europe has been thinking about this for a significantly longer period of time. And so that shift from the car at the center to all users, all modalities, all ages, all abilities is a significant and really important paradigm shift. And communities that are making that shift are seeing some really positive things happen. I can tell a very brief story about that shift in paradigm and the result of that, because I think we need more of these success stories to help us make that shift from car centrism to the non-driver at the center. I got a call from a constituent sometime this week who shared with me that they had advocated for an accessible pedestrian signal in their area. And for those who aren't familiar, an accessible pedestrian signal is one that's controlled by the user. And when you hit the button, you get a verbal message about the status of the signal. And then you get a verbal message when the signal is in your favor and it's time to cross. And these are incredibly helpful and have been shown repeatedly to reduce car versus pedestrian incident. She was so excited. They had advocated for this by calling the city of Madison and were told, yes, absolutely, we're happy to install that when we do some street work. And by the way, we are going to be putting them in at several places along that corridor because of the level of older adults that live in that area, shopping, access to work. We really recognize that we need a strong pedestrian infrastructure here. And when I listened to her message, two things happened for me. One, her whole demeanor was excited, and I could hear that sense of liberation in her voice. It was like, oh my God, I can get to the grocery. I can get to my bank. I can get to my work. And it was liberating, I think is the best way to describe it. She was so excited. And so that's a win. But the other win is that these changes are happening within systemic change, initiatives like Vision Zero and complete green streets, so that they're not one-off incidences, but they're how are we changing the network. So that, is one of my hopes for today, is that folks come away with understanding that being a non-driver isn't a problem for the non-driver to constantly be trying to fix, but that we have an incredible ability to flip the narrative to this being a systems change and equity issue.
You may have touched on it, and I apologize if I missed it, but I'm looking for an example for what we could accurately call a connected network. What is an example of that?
Sure. An example is that you can get from point A to point B without risking your life. It's that simple. So if I can be in an urban area and I can walk to the bus stop and manage safe street crossings because the infrastructure is built in a way that allows pedestrians to walk safely. So things like curb cuts, those accessible pedestrian signals, other tools, bump outs, that I can walk from my home to the bus stop. I can get on the bus. The bus will take me to, approximately where I need to go without multiple transfers, because that's also part of the connected network, is that there's a lot of fluidity. I can get there. Then I get off the bus and that network is connected so that I can now get to my destination. And we do that almost as smoothly as, or even in a perfect world, as smoothly as someone in a car, and at roughly the same time span as someone in a car. That being a non-driver should not make it be that it takes me 3 hours to get to and from my 20-minute doctor appointment, where it only takes the car driver 15 minutes to get there and 15 minutes to get back. And the reality for non-drivers is that we spend triple or quadruple amount of time trying to get to the thing than we actually spend at the thing. That's what I mean by the connected network.
Yeah, good. That's a powerful explanation, a powerful point. Let's stay on the matter of the non-driver. Tammy Jackson, I want to return to your point of view on these things. Starting with the non-driver, the issues. What are the impacts of non-driver issues on families and communities?
Well, I think we've touched on before how many family members are stepping in to fill the gaps where their transportation isn't. And that time deficit that Denise talks about isn't only for non-drivers, it's also for the person who's stepping in to be the driver, that's taking them out of their job and their day. And in some cases, taking them out of the job permanently as they're having to face an increasing level of care. And it's important to also remember that our family structures have changed. There are lots of people who have smaller families, whose families are geographically dispersed across the country. There may actually only be a couple people around who are able and willing to step into that role. And when I talk with legislators, many of whom do a lot of nodding as they're thinking about their older parents and where's that point where those keys are no longer a safe option for them and what happens then. And for a lot of people, non-driver status is becoming the thing that dictates where they can live, which has a much broader impact. And for lots of folks, moving to someplace else actually doesn't solve their problems. It's just a little less bad. So you may be in a rural setting and see that there are folks that are draining into a community and then moving somewhere else. And it's not because they want to leave. They don't want to leave their friend networks and the life that they built. It's because they're moving because their abilities have changed. And we haven't built a system that allows people to actually live in the places that they have lived for generations, in some cases, just because they can't do this one thing.
An issue's connection to a person is often connected to a person's pocketbook. What are the economic implications of transportation equity?
We've talked a little bit about affordability, and I'm going to give an example of my own. We have board members. Part of our board are people with developmental disabilities. And we have virtual board meetings as well as in-person ones. And I have a board member, a young woman who lives in Broadhead. And she attends the board meetings in person. The only option for her is a cab. She's commuting from a rural area to Madison, and there's not really a good connection for public transit there. It costs her $175 one way, which of course our board covers because she's there on board business. That isn't economically feasible for most people. And many people who are non-drivers are also low income. So when you think about transportation as an equity income and how it defines the boundaries of where people can live, what jobs they can they get to the higher paying job? No, well, they're not getting it then. And the fact that so many people who are non-drivers are also non-drivers because owning and operating a vehicle is expensive. The idea that public transportation, which is limited, is also out of reach because of cost is an important one. And, as Barbara said, when you have economic struggles amplify all other struggles. So if you have a hard time getting places, you have a hard time getting to medical appointments, you have a hard time getting to the things that would make you feel connected and less lonely and more productive and more independent, all of those things that our board is concerned about, inclusion, integration, you really need to be able to actively get yourself out into the community. And when you can't do that, that's a really hard thing for people's mental health and well-being.
We have about 20 minutes remaining. I think we're doing pretty well on time. We're going to shift into some policy questions. Before I move back with Barbara, though, Tammy, how do policy shifts come into play in the work toward positive change, and what kind of policy?
You know, I think I'll share an example from one of our non-driver advisory committee members, which I just think was really a revelation, even in the way I think about transportation. You know, it was our colleague, Nick Musson, who works for an aging organization. And he was discussing a volunteer driver program, which is something he's very passionate about. And he said, you know what? I've never thought about this before, but we've been approaching transportation as if it was a charity model. And when you think about it, that is how we have designed a lot of these very separate, you know, pots of money for certain populations to go for certain places. And he's like, this isn't charity. This is a basic need that everyone has. And so that's a real revelation in shifting that, you know, not only do we need to think about non-drivers as being a huge part of the population, they always have been, and that population is growing, but we also need to think about transportation as basic access that everyone needs, as opposed to a charity that if someone else decides they can provide it is, you know, something you can accept. And I think Denise's points on policy shifting, you know, we have designed in the last 75 years a lot of our planning structures, how we think about where do we site, you know, buildings and services, even how we select our juries on the presumption that somebody drives a car. That's not true. So part of the policy shift comes into how do we shift more towards thinking that transportation and how people get to places is not based necessarily on one mode of transportation that we assume everybody independently has.
We need to move beyond the wheels, is what I hear you saying.
Yes.
Barbara, the state budget process is in full swing at the Capitol, as you well know. Will you speak about specific expenditures, things you want to see make it into the state budget when it comes to transportation equity?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you know, you've just heard from Tammy and Denise, really broad, expansive vision of what transportation equity looks like. And when it comes to the budget, you know, I think our budget currently is very car centric. So we have a long ways to go to realize the vision that you're hearing about today. That being said, I think that there are some specifics we can share with you. And in the context that the cost of providing transportation services has continued to increase. So we're a statewide agency. We hear from people who are non-drivers around the state. And what we hear is troubling. We hear about people who rely on specialized transportation, paratransit and transit services, and that those services are eroding. Routes are being cut, hours are being reduced, struggling to maintain the status quo. And as you've heard, we have so far to go. So in terms of the budget, we see a lot of opportunities to help move us forward. And those include investments in transit. Transit services, including bus systems, are essential for non-drivers and for people to maintain employment. So seeing increases in that area, including specifically for the cities of Milwaukee and Madison, We want to see the transit restored to the 2019 to 2021 levels. There were significant cuts in the last budget because of the ARPA funding that was available. That's short-term funding, and it's going to go away. In terms of a lot of the services that are important for people with disabilities and older adults, we would like to see increases in paratransit, specialized transportation, including both for accessible transportation as well as mobility management, which is so important to optimize use of those services. We would like to also see some specialized funding for transportation for voting. You've heard a little bit about the challenges that many non-drivers who have disabilities face in getting to their polling place or getting to the DMV to get a photo ID. As a non-driver, they don't have a driver's license.
Could you differentiate between what mass paratransit is and what specialized transportation is?
Yes, absolutely. So paratransit is actually a requirement of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Those municipalities that have some type of public transit are required to also provide complimentary paratransit service to people with disabilities who can't use the fixed route service, and it has to be provided within certain parameters. So in Wisconsin, we have some communities, usually in larger urban areas, that receive paratransit funding. In addition to that, we also have specialized transportation assistance, and that also provides state and federal funds for individuals with disabilities and older adults. And there are several different programs that receive that funding. There are county assistance programs, and there also is a tribal elderly transportation assistance grant program that is funded through specialized transportation. They're all important, and we'd like to see increases in all of them. And I would also point out that it's important to have some additional funding for our counties and municipalities because their budgets are so critical to funding those services. So increases in shared revenue, the ability to have a dedicated funding source are key. Often their hands are tied. They want to maintain and increase services, but they have restrictions in current law that don't allow them to have the autonomy to increase funding. We hope that that will happen through the state budget process.
Thank you, Barbara. We have a little over 10 minutes remaining, and I want to ask Denise, Jess, if you could come back on board here and help us connect how all of these items are related, and not only that, speak a little bit about how to advocate for change. Denise, how do non-driver issues spread out over the diversity of people and backgrounds and cross over into other issue areas?
Yeah, thank you. I think that my colleagues and I have, kind of pointed that out. So I want to be really clear about it, that transportation, I think for the council, and I believe for other organizations, is really our top priority because it feeds everything else. So if for folks working on food insecurity issues, getting to the food pantry, getting to the grocery, getting to the farm, all of those things are reliant on some form of transportation. And then even if you can take the bus to get the food, carrying things that are heavy. So food insecurity and transportation go together. Family health, both physical and emotional, go together. So many of our non-drivers talk about that stress to the family that we've been hitting on. And the way that manifests is sometimes through, neglect and abuse because the relationships are so strained, or at least a lot of conflict. So families, folks working in family care and also looking at family systems need to be looking at transportation, getting our kids to school, particularly our homeless and highly mobile children that aren't on a regular bus route. So, folks working in the schools need to have transportation at the front of their minds as well. Folks working on healthcare, I've seen way too many, and in my own personal experience, talk to way too many doctors and care providers who are not connecting the dots. And the hard part is that when the non-driver is late to those appointments, it's seen as a deficit of the non-driver, like we didn't care enough to be there on time. Well, we were working really, really hard to get there on time. So healthcare providers understanding what the impact is, and if we're skipping appointments, why it might be that we're less well. So we have got so many places to connect the dots. So whatever your advocacy passion is, I want to ask you to ask yourself the question continually, how does my issue that I connect with connect to non-drivers? Who am I forgetting when I don't remember to bring non-drivers to the conversation? So that's one piece of it. Yeah, go ahead, Andy.
Well, I'm sorry to cut you off. I was going to say the next step then is taking that knowledge and getting off the sidelines and advocating. If you would please talk a little bit about the ways and means of advocacy at the state level.
Perfect. That's exactly where I was headed. So with the state budget, in its development, this is a critical time to contact your state legislator. We saw significant turnover in the membership of the state legislature in the November election. So there are a lot of first-time educators or legislators there. Our role and your role is to help them learn. They deal with so incredibly many things that they cannot have expertise on it all. So bringing forward the issues of the non-driver when you have conversations about them, making it real, telling your story, talking with them about what more equitable transportation would look like on that big scale, but also then what would that look like in our state budget? What needs to be funded? So those kinds of conversations with your legislator are so incredibly important. Coming to a joint finance committee meeting, but then also doing the work on the local level. All that funding comes into the communities, and then they have to make smart decisions about how to use it. So connecting with your local officials about what's important to you in transportation and pedestrian and bike infrastructure.
Denise, we've reached, we're close to the end of our time together. I want to ask each panelist for a few closing remarks. And since you have the floor at the moment, I want to ask you to start about a minute of closing thoughts.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you, Andy. So I think the biggest thing that I want to leave our listeners today with, and I'm so grateful that you're here, is to take a part in flipping the paradigm from car centrism to the human being at the center of the trip. And so whatever that looks like in your world, how do we do that? And even if it's meaning that you're bringing it up in more casual conversation, you're bringing it up in your advocacy, that I think is critical for us to make the significant changes that we need to have, is that we understand that we need to be creating for all modes, all users, all abilities, all ages, and that every single one of us is a player in that paradigm shift.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Denise. Barbara Beckert, I sense that I may have moved things along before you were able to complete your thoughts on specific expenditures in the state budget. So will you please take a minute and a half to not only make your closing remarks, but to add to that subject if you feel the need.
Well, thank you, Andy. I'm happy to add to the discussion we had about the state budget. Some of the other opportunities I think that we have are increasing funding in the budget to fund coordination of services for non-drivers, something that we've talked about quite a bit today, and that it's exciting to see move forward in the governor's executive budget. We'd like to help get it across the finish line. In addition to that, I think there are a lot of opportunities to address roadway considerations in state law that support non-drivers with the complete street concepts of helping local communities to safely integrate all modes of transportation. And finally, we would like to see expanded hours at the Division of Motor Vehicles, particularly in rural areas. Those hours are very limited, and that can make it difficult for individuals, particularly non-drivers, to get photo IDs that are important for voting and for other activities. You know, and in closing, I would say that we all have a vested interest. We may be drivers currently, but our lives can change at any minute. And if we live long enough, we are all likely to be non-drivers. Wisconsin is an aging state, so transportation equity matters to each of us. And the lack of transportation has negative consequences for our economy, for inclusion, for the workforce in Wisconsin. So let's get going and advance transportation equity in our state budget.
Barbara, thank you for those closing thoughts, additional thoughts on the state budget, and for all of your insight throughout the hour. And Tammy Jackson, 60 seconds or so for some of your last considerations.
Yeah, I think picking up on Barbara's point, you know, if you're not a non-driver now, statistically, it's likely that you're going to become one or end up supporting somebody who is one. And when I think about, you know, big picture, because we're a systems change agency, so that's what we do. Non-driver issues are workforce development or workforce mobility issues, and they're economic development issues. And there are lots of places in our state where if you don't have good non-driver infrastructure, if you don't have good broadband to help people get connected, if you don't have good care infrastructure and affordable housing, these are all issues that are very intricately entwined as to whether or not communities are livable. And right now, if you're a non-driver, most places aren't. So this is a pressing policy issue that we need to keep shifting and working on, because ultimately there are lots of beautiful places in this state and everybody should be able to live where they want to without worrying about whether or what that impacts on their daily life.
Thank you, Tammy Jackson. Thank you, Denise, and Barbara. Folks, we covered a lot of ground today, but there are some main takeaways. Transportation inequities impact everyone, not just non-drivers. There are impacts on employment, education, access to healthcare, food security, voting, essentially all aspects of life, as we've heard during these last 60 minutes or so. Non-drivers live throughout the state, as Denise pointed out. Urban, suburban, small town, and rural. If you don't drive or own a car, it's difficult to impossible to get to where you need to go on your schedule due to limited options, including a lack of pedestrian bike infrastructure, eroding of the services that were previously available, patchworks of services that are challenging to navigate, and services that end, as we learned about, at the city or county line or the municipal line. And finally, we need to transform our policies and practices to put the person at the center who needs to get where they are going. Create systems for all modes, all users, all abilities, all ages. As I mentioned at the start of our time together, we're gathered today in connection with Community Shares of Wisconsin, an organization that brings nonprofits together to raise awareness of their important work. Our forum is part of March 7th, today's Big Share event. That's Community Share's online day of giving focused on social and environmental justice. Nearly 70 nonprofits host this important day of fundraising. Thebigshare.org is where to go to give to our organizations represented here or to Community Shares. We hope you'll do that right away. Thank you again, Denise, Jess, Barbara, Beckert, and Tammy Jackson. I'm Andy Moore. And thank you for being with us online and for your support of this important community work by going to thebigshare.org to make a gift to support this effort. Have a great day.